I think I'd like to pick up a little bit more on what you just said, Dan, about the way in which moral theology in Asia, certainly in India, it's all bound up with a whole host of issues, and they're all lived issues. They're all very concrete. And I'm thinking here not simply of the conference itself, but on our trip around Bangalore on the back of a rickshaw, we saw a number of billboards in Bangalore.
Right. Yeah.
And these are government-sponsored billboards as part of a government campaign in response to the treatment of questions of respect and even the basic humanity of babies who are born, particularly female children. And so you have billboards that have signs that say, if you kill the girl child, you kill the future. Now, I found this as a Westerner who's there at a conference of moral theologians incredibly confronting. Not just because of the message itself, which is a government-sponsored message of life in a culture in which there is clearly evidence of that, elements of that throwaway culture that we hear Pope Francis talk about, and quite literally throwing away of children just because of their gender. So female babies not being welcomed for various cultural and historical reasons. But also because as a Westerner, we have our own issues around what we mean by the human person, around the respect and treatment of the human person from child to into their old age. We have our own gender disparity, and in some contexts in Australia, that can also become life and death. And more recently in Australia, we've had our own public awareness campaign around domestic violence. And so it's not as if, as a Westerner, I'm looking at this and I'm given the luxury of saying, well, this is something terrible that's happening in India, and clearly they've got their own cultural problems to sort out, but I'm looking forward to going back to normality in Australia, where I can walk away from those issues. Because actually, we have our own similar issues. Our approach to them hasn't been to put up billboards in that way, signs on street corners. But it struck me that one of the challenges there in India, with their own cultural complexities, which are very different to those in Australia, we actually have something that's shared. And it goes to the heart of what it is to be a human being, what it is to welcome the stranger, the other, what it is to look at a child or look at another human being and see something that is a gift, that is to be welcomed, over which I have no authority in terms of their life or their death. No authority. Except in terms of what I might do to protect them, to care for them, to be attentive to them, to befriend them. So there was something confronting, and there's something peculiar about the local ways in which that issue is there present. But it also struck me that the challenge is something which should wake me out a little bit more out of my own sleepiness, if you like, on that issue in Australia, or issues that are caught up in that bundle of issues. Because you wonder what people thought of as they walked past those billboards. You wonder, did they recognise in those billboards language that is meant to speak to them, or is there something much more deeper and much more complex that needs to be dealt with?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that the challenge I spotted for the church was slightly different, although, I mean, I think what you've observed there is brilliant. It was what it is like to be a church which is a minority, because we kept hearing again and again that for every Asian country, Catholicism is a minority except for the Philippines and Timor-Leste. And our Indian friends kept telling us this, they kept saying to us, do you realise Catholics are only 2% of the population here in India? And I kept fighting back and saying, do you realise that's the whole population of Australia on balance that they have there? But it was really interesting the papers coming from all of those countries where Catholicism is a minority, because so much of what they were focused on was having to do moral theology in a context where part and parcel of their discipline is learning how to dialogue with other dominant worldviews. So, for example, in India, learning how to dialogue with the major religion in India, which is Hinduism, and to try and unpack commonalities and differences. Not as, like, sometimes we get caught in this, I think, in our American, European, Australian moral theology. Dialogue, in a sense, is a parenthesis that we can tack on to the end of a sentence, which remains fairly cohesive in itself. But this dialogue was actually part and parcel of the project itself. It couldn't be suspended until a later convenient time. It was at the very heart of what they were on about. And so I think the challenge of navigating that dialogue is huge. When we come back to Australian shores, I think one of the great learnings is how important thinking of ourselves as part of the Asian church is, because this is our doorstep, far more than Europe and America are. These are the people with whom we share our lives now. And Australian politicians keep talking about the Asian century. I think it's so important for us as Catholics in the Australian context to begin to understand how the church functions in these different areas, who are so close to us and yet are in such a different situation from us too. And how it is that we can then draw that back into how we function as a discipline in moral theology here is enormously important.